made out of beryllium. And the other part is, the cultural match. This is the type of thing that we want to get engaged in. Well, prior to me on the board as the chairman, there had been an agreement that we would cough up $4 million in cash to build the building and start this company. And it sounded great and everything. It had a high-profile congressman's seal of approval. It got a lot of press and everything. And it was hard to. What happened is I got an attorney to look at the business contract, and there was 4 layers in which you could make profit. 3 of those layers went to the company, and the last one would have been ours, but there is no money left over. So I said, well, what benefit is that to the tribe? So, again, it was hard to convince this congressman, which we needed his support, he was really upset. And it took him a while to realize that he was this way. So the other is cultural match. Again, based on with our people's indigenous people, and sovereignty is. Well, I'll tell you what sovereignty is not. Sovereignty is not a tribal name for a Long Island iced tea. Okay, sovereignty. I just trying to see if you're awake. But it's something that in order. What we're seeing here, as far as access to capital, is that it can happen, but we have to know what those conditions are, and we have to know again what are the benefits. In the early days, we used to get grants, federal grants, because we needed to employ people, whether or not we needed the project. So we're long past that. So now we need to make that assessment. And the same, especially in Mexico, if you don't have the structure, and we're looking at management structures and stuff, then we ourselves will say, don't do it. The money's going to disappear just like that. But you have to have the structure, the order, and you have to have the buy-in. I think taking a semi-cautious approach in which we have a tendency to want to do things in a rush. But then, our own cultural upbringing says you do things when you're ready. So sometimes it's a contradiction, and we find ourselves, like wanting to do something because that's the way it's done. On the other hand, it is hard to sit there and just wait. And sometimes the opportunity passes by. But the way our belief system is that so.
Thank you. I think one of the biggest things that they're looking at is stability in communities. And you look around British Columbia, there's a lot of very tiny First Nations, quite smaller than us. Some of them are only 200 members. We're 800 members, and our location helps as much. We're right on the peninsula, we're right on the highway, maybe 4 kilometers from the airport, 6 kilometers from the BC ferries, and only 20 minutes from downtown Victoria. So our location is prime for drawing interest. I think one of the things that we had to put in place was financial management policy in our community. So even myself as chief can't go in there and change anything. It's all directed by policy, and it's in order to draw interest and also to keep everything in place. Like even for our new gymnasium with the GST, 65% of that budget is committed to that gymnasium, so it's own source revenues, and then 20% is for governance. And the needs of the community are so plentiful that we prioritize these things, but you're still lacking for the things that you need to implement. And we said we're losing our elders. We need that's costly, going through the courts is extremely costly. Even just for the smallest right for commercial fishery under Douglas Treaty, that's $500,000. And so, you think, why do we have to fight for these things that we're already guaranteed in our contract, our treaty? Well, you have to bring that treaty, the fish are gone, so you have to look at other parts of that treaty you can implement now whether it be for economic development and that's probably in the enclosed fields part of it, where we don't define the home treaty, but we say what was protected by the treaty, and we did have gambling, we did have commercial sales of our harvests and whatnot, so we have to bring that to today's age and implement it and create revenues for not only the band in general, but for the individuals to prosper as well. So it's maybe turned into a juggling act, just like my bank account. But you just have to be thinking of new things and how things not only fit into legislation, but also in the treaty. So, and the government is afraid of the Douglas treaties. They don't know how to deal with us. They don't know how to negotiate with us. And they have nowhere to go. So I think they're being put into a corner where they're facing us now, and they have to deal with us. And it's up to us to make the best advantage.
I see I have the sun shining directly in my eyes here. So I can't see the faces in front of me, but I also wanted to open up the floor for questions and further discussion.
Well, I have a question about human development capital. So you've got a population in Mexico, Yaqui people, and then you've got a population in Tucson. You're the vice chair. How do you facilitate the flow of people back and forth across that border for employment, for development, when you've got those new laws that are potentially coming in that could block the flow of people? Because often families make wealth by going into other countries, developing some capital, bringing it back home. How are you finding your ways around that issue of immigration? That's right.
That's how we approach this. We had to, about a month ago, I had to go with the Tucson Convention and Visitors Bureau to Sonora, to Mexico, to talk with the Chambers of Commerce there to convince them not to boycott Arizona. And it was really interesting because some of the information that the fellow was giving them, he was the vice president, was that I think he said 70% or 80% of the people that are hired in that industry are actually from Mexico. They're legal, but if you boycott, then you are going to hurt them. Then they're going to come to Mexico, and then what are you going to do? So it was, to make a long story short, there's a continuing discussion, I think it's this month, but what they want to do is talk about strengthening the relationships that they have. For example, we have an amphitheater, and in the amphitheater, some of the artists have boycotted the Phoenix area or Arizona. There is one that's coming to us next month that we kind of stole from them. Her name is Rihanna. I don't know who she is, but she's apparently very popular. But they have a 16 or 18,000 seat amphitheater. We have a 5,000 seat amphitheater. So she dumped them to come to us. I guess we're happy. But as far as the flow, yes, there are mainly the women that come over from Yaqui. They have their visas and stuff, so they can come and go all day long. They have no problem. They do come and sell whatever it is, artisans primarily, and they do come and work at our area, you know, and they have to go through the same normal processes as anybody else. But
Were there
it's,
any special recognition that your tribe was unique compared to, you know, the general flow back and forth because of that historic relationship? Or is that just really too hard to put on the table?
well, we're working towards that, you know, because, you know, number one, our employment, if it's the casino or if it's the other, the majority of what it's our money. It's not federal funding. Federal funding requires you to have, you know, citizenship and that. But, you know, there's also the IRS we got to consider it, and there's a number of other laws. So, yeah, we have to be careful, but at the same time, we want to be able to support what they do. Because, for example, healers, traditional healers, we have them in Arizona. We have to bring them from Yaqui to come and work with our people. And we found a way of being able to pay them without, you know, getting into trouble. And those are the things that we have to do. Conversely, the system that Mexico has, you know, for example, we started working with the shrimp, the fishermen, and we offer the shrimp in our casino now, but we eventually want to go to other tribes, other casinos, because they have kind of that supply and they're really good, high quality stuff. But that's kind of how we're working it. We probably need to get a little bit more aggressive in terms of, you know, trying to, for example, we're building a hotel. It's going to be done 11/11/11 at 11/11 in the morning. I know it's corny, but you know, that particular industry, we can use a lot of our people that come in, because we also have to bring them during our cultural ceremony season, Easter season, and they're without work here, so they have to leave whatever work they have to be here. You know, quite a number, about 2 months. So we're trying to get the. We have it established already, the organization in which we can look at doing intra-company transfers from Mexico to us. So, you know, it's a slow process, but we know what we need to do, so we're trying to get it done.
Thank you. I could jump on another question, which is interested in the case of Bolivia. We know that Evo Morales is indigenous and that there's this new constitution that's been approved, I'm not sure it's been ratified, that has pretty strong indigenous protections in it. And do you see any kind of waves happening to create a greater recognition of indigenous rights in Latin America because of what is happening in Bolivia? Or is it still too soon for that to really catch on?
No. You know, Latin America is not known for stable governments generally. And I think it's been fairly erratic. Bolivia's been fairly erratic. And I think, you know, Colombia has a very strong framework. Technically, Guyana has a very strong framework. Technically, Argentina has a strong framework, and technically Brazil has a strong framework, and technically Chile has a strong framework, and technically Peru does. It's just, I think, you know, I was working on the issue of, in Ecuador once, and I was working on the Colombians, the FARC, would come across the border into Ecuador, and they would basically take over all of these small towns where there were services. So the indigenous peoples in Ecuador had to move further away because they were worried about their children being taken back into Colombia. So I was working on this project, and we went there, and we arrived Sunday night. It's Monday morning. We met with the minister that we were working with. He was fired Tuesday. We met with the interim on Wednesday. He was gone Thursday, and the new one was there Friday. That is kind of Latin America. So I think, you know, you have Venezuela, you know, also being kind of erratic, but I'm not sure that it's flowing that way. I think there's, Yeah, I think there's a kind of a standing back and kind of seeing what's happening and how it's all going to work out. Because, you know, Peru has also had indigenous leaders. Yeah, I think it's not, I'm not sure what's going to happen, because I think there's also what happens, there's always there's the elite side of Latin America that says crazy, not going to last very long, not going to be able to make it work economically, because it is kind of a little bit strange. I mean, Venezuela I think is more interesting because Venezuela has a lot of money. So they can kind of do what they want to do. Bolivia is getting more money because of the oil, but I'm not sure that they're in that position yet to be able to just really thumb their nose at everyone else. So, you know, for example, I mean, the best example of how Bolivia is operating is on the climate change issue. You know, there's this huge statement in Cochabamba recently about how Bolivia was not participating. You know, it was very public, very politically charged, and it was the same week that they had accepted the money from the UN RED program. So I think that is what's hampering Bolivia being considered a leader on these issues. And I think the key, and this gets back to the issue of access to capital, is the key is if they can make it work in this new paradigm. And I think there's some, I don't know, from what I'm seeing anyway, they're not seeing that it's working this way.
Thank you very much. I was very much enjoying your comments about both questions about sort of the needs for creativity in developing strategies and for kind of attention to the ongoing sort of development within the communities of their own visions. But I'm wondering if you could speak to a bit, in either the negative or the positive side, is what things it would be helpful from your perspective to see from people who work with the law, who interact with your communities on this side. And particularly I'm thinking about lawyers who work with the communities to try and help bring about these kinds of strategies. So I guess the question is, what things from your perspective would it be useful if lawyers working with your communities knew to facilitate this kind of work, or the reverse side, what kinds of things you've seen from lawyers coming into your communities that have been not helpful as you've tried to work through these questions of economic sort of capital development and investment strategies?
Well, I think we're new into the game of our own lands management, but we're very fortunate that we have a fellow, John Galis, and he was our lands manager with Indian Affairs while he was working on his law degree. And so when he finally became a lawyer, he came to work for us. So he understands our issues already. And now what's the biggest thing with Indian Affairs is the turnover. You would get somebody educated and then they'd be gone. And then you'd get the next person up to speed and then they'd be gone. And so that's one of the biggest pluses. We have someone there that understands our historical issues but also has a vision for the future to help us resolve those outstanding issues and to move forward into opening up things not only for ourselves as a band but for individuals. So that's one of the pluses. As far as lawyers, I think the biggest hindrance is, first of all, not until recently were we allowed to even have lawyers. It was against the law. So when we first got involved with lawyers, it was a brand new experience because we never dealt with them before, even though we dealt with government who always had their legal team with them. And so that was a new legislation that changed not that long ago. But I think that was the biggest hindrance is longevity of staff working on your behalf in the department. Other than that, getting a bad one that you could never get rid of. I hope that answers.
It's a great start.
With us, we have our current head of our attorneys is a tribal member, but prior to he's from the law school there in Tucson. But it was 50 years before, I mean, it was 50 years back that the last tribal member at the time of the tribe graduated from the last law school. There's a renewed interest, or there's a new interest, I should say, in we have a number of students now that are going to law school or have intentions of going to law school. But at the same time, you know, my, you say this in a room full of lawyers, potential lawyers. Well, lawyers, I've always said, you know, it's, if you want to do something, they're there to tell you how you can do it. In a tribal state, you have somebody who tells you you can't do it, and you can have the village idiot tell you you can't do it. So you need somebody that can understand the value, the vision, you know, of what the tribe is trying to do. Because I know there are tribes that have the lawyer they can't get rid of, you know, because, and I don't know if we, you know, we haven't really had the problem, but we, on the other side, we have some really good people that have helped us throughout the years, and, you know, the value they give to us is a lot more than, I would say, another group like anthropologists, archaeologists.
Yeah, I think just to kind of almost just summarize, I think lawyers working with communities really have to feel that they're the problem solvers for the communities, that they are kind of the community saying this is what we want to do, and then that person kind of almost helps them do some of the prerequisite framework type stuff. But, you know, they're not really, I mean, I think what happens, and kind of going through law school, et cetera, you can kind of see how it happens, is they kind of forget that they don't actually know. Because you go through law school and there's kind of this focus on knowing. And then you go to work with the community, and I think some young lawyers especially think they know better or think they know how to do it. And I think that, yeah, I think the best way it's been explained to me is that, you know, you're problem solvers and advocates, but of what you're being told, you know, is a priority or is something that the community is trying to do.
I think I can add to that, having taught law students and having seen them go out and having worked in communities with law students. I think one of the biggest challenges is that law students are trained to think very sort of professionally in a very formalistic fashion. And I find that the closer lawyers get to a community, if they're not a member of the community, there's a risk that they do not properly filter the dynamics of the community with what they perceive to be their own mission in providing a service. And so there's this sort of cultural conflict where they can run the risk of failing to realize that the community at times is looking at the legal system as a means to an end. I mean, they didn't design the Indian Act. You know, they didn't choose to be governed by the Indian Act. They have to use it in a certain way. And so on the cultural community level side, it's very hard to train students to kind of objectively open up their minds to not judge the culture that they're working with. You just have to really, really pay close attention to the day-to-day dynamics. You know, and I think at the core level, appreciate that all the communities are struggling, you know, to survive in this system that they didn't create. And so it begins this new dialogue of customary law, which is not a dialogue that is formally discussed like in law school, right? The idea of customary law is very hard for law students to grasp, and I think so the degree to which I think in my own work I can help them, I just try to make them aware that at times it may look like this, but it's really that. You know, you just have to keep your mind open and not judge, because actually here's the problem with lawyers, right? They think they know everything, right? There's some of the worst business decisions, right, are made by lawyers, and part of it is because the assuredness that legal education gives you. So that's kind of to come full circle. I've seen that happen where it's sort of like the lawyers taking over, you know? I mean, and that really wasn't their original purpose in the engagement, so.
It could add to that, like some of our young bucks, you know, we have a concept called Yaqui law. It's an oral tradition, it's not written anywhere, but it applies mainly now with our ceremonial people. So even the court and the law enforcement respects it, but the young bucks say, if it's not written on paper, then it doesn't exist. Well, you know, we have to go through the whole process of telling them why it's there and how like it. It takes a while, but you know, it's something we have to do. It's very effective. It used to be include capital punishment, but we don't do that anymore.
Another question is about travel courts. The Harvard project on American Indian Economic Development said that if the community has a travel court, that automatically would mean that they have a 5% greater GDP within their community. That is, there's a higher rate of economic development just by the fact of having a travel court. In your experience, how might travel courts help in facilitating economic development, or is that not something?
Well, there's the talk that I hear is that you know, you have to have at least one, depending on your court, lawyer trained judge, because if you want, the majority of agreements, they want you to waive sovereignty. And that's not the case. They want to see a court that is going to be fair. So, you know, there's a tendency to say, well, if you have a business court, then let me see what it looks like. Let me see the structure. You know, and is this person, you know, trained to be, you know, in that area? It's because, as you know, in tribal courts, you know, most tribal courts require only that you be a tribal member. Period. A lot of you elders, or some of them are, in fact, part of the council. Must be difficult, but you know, that's for us. I think it's. I've seen that it's a benefit to such a system.